Well, I'm excited to be here with Dru Johnson, who is among many other things, other projects and podcasts and books, he's the recent author of What Hath Darwin to Do with Scripture, which I was happy to review on the channel, put out by IVP Academic. Yeah, I'm excited to have this conversation. And we'll see where things go. But I'm also a big fan, just to boost this at the top, I'm a big fan of the book Biblical Philosophy.
Oh,
That might be a hard turn to get into that on this conversation, but I just wanted to name it.
that's my favorite child. When you look at your books like your children, you're
Yeah.
like, that's the one I really love.
Oh,
The biblical philosophy and
is that
knowledge
really
by
your favorite?
ritual. Yeah, that and knowledge by ritual, I think, are
Ah,
secretly where I've done my best thinking and work.
oh wow.
But maybe other people don't think that, but that's okay. There's a
I love.
symposium coming out in Philosophia Christi, the
Okay.
journal, where like four philosophers respond to it, and
Oh,
I was
cool.
surprised how favorable they were towards it. So
Oh, that's great. That's great to
yeah,
hear. I loved it. I didn't realize that it was your one of your favorites. That's great. I highly recommend it to anybody watching. Would be interested, I think, in
well,
it for
thank you
sure.
very much.
A little bit of heavier lift than this book for
It
sure,
is definitely, yeah.
but I would say yeah, it's worth going through. All right, we'll table that for now. Yeah, I reviewed the book on the channel. If anyone's interested in watching the review, that'll give you a main idea, like a pretty concise kind of look at what you're doing in the book. So I could point them in that direction for that. But I would love to ask you, um, what was your goal? Like, kind of the why behind going into this topic at this time within this particular format.
Yeah, I want to note two people, Jeff Fulkerson, who headed the Henry Center while I was there, and then he really pushed me to write. I mean, he heard my ideas and my thinking. He's like, I think this would actually be a really good
Mm,
project, possibly a book project. And then after I had written it, I was still a little timid about the manuscript. And John Boyd, the editor at IVP, he's just a brilliant guy, fantastic thinker, pushed me to think even more specifically about some ideas that I had developed in the book. So, I mean, it's like everything you want in an editor: someone who will push back, someone
mm,
who will push forward,
mhm.
who gets the vision of the book. He understood that this was not just a creation book or a creation versus
Right.
evolution book, but it was actually a book about the conceptual worlds of creation in Scripture and the conceptual world of evolutionary science today, and kind of from 1850 forward. So he really understood the project, and he calls it. So I'll quote him here. He said, "This is a really disruptive book."
Mm,
And when he said that, and he meant it in a good way, that this is meant to disrupt the conversation, that there's an unheard voice here, and that specifically is the conceptual world of the biblical authors themselves. That hasn't really been given a seat at the table. A lot of people talk about what scripture is doing, but I feel like they're not giving the full voice to what I think the scripture is trying to do on these evolutionary topics, these themes that run through natural selection, at least. And so, yeah, so I think it is trying to disrupt the conversation. Um, and in talking to Swami Das, he said he thought it did a really good job, which again was a high compliment from
yeah.
a real working scientist. He also said, "Hey, you changed everything I told you to change in the manuscript." And I said, "Of course. What kind of an idiot wouldn't
It
listen
wouldn't
to the
listen.
science? I had a couple
Yeah.
scientists read it, and everything they told me to correct, I corrected." So
That's great. Yeah, I love so one thing I love about the book is that it charts a different um just charts a different path in what feels like a pretty stalemated conversation
yeah,
between quote unquote Genesis versus evolution or young Earth versus evolution or whatever. I love that about it, and I want to talk about that, but also I want to maybe if we could take a second to underline the phrase conceptual world. How would
Mhm.
you? How is that similar to or different from other concepts like worldview or social imaginary or like, yeah, what does that
Yeah.
mean and what are you getting at with that?
There's probably some overlap with social imaginary, if you know that
Charles Taylor, yeah.
concept. And then yeah, and then there's probably some with worldview. My colleague Craig Bartholomew really loves worldview. He thinks that it
Hmm.
does a lot of work. I'm less enamored with worldview because I'm more of an embodied ritual practice person. So I think conceptual world, I mean, from the work you do with the earth all day long, the community that you live in, the ritual practices that you participate in, and just the embodied behaviors create available concepts and paradigms for you that work within your world, that might not work in another world. So I teach
Yeah.
18-year-olds every day. And I realize I'm a Gen Xer, you know, I'm almost 50, I'll be 50 this year. So a lot of analogies and metaphors that I use, they have no access to because they didn't grow up with in the same embodied experience. They didn't grow up in a unwired, unconnected world. There was no, you know, they don't know a world without flat screens. They don't know a world, you know, like they just don't know the same physical world that I grew up in, where a lot of my analogies and metaphors were created. And so it's interesting. I'll throw metaphors out there and ask them, what do you think this means? And it like, rarely will they ever pick up exactly what it means, because they
Wow.
have a different embodied experience, and that's just within one generation.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
so the biblical authors have, so I mean, it's funny because you asked me about concepts and I talked about embodied, physical,
Yeah.
ritual, right? But I think those are all directly tied together. And I think that because the biblical authors use particular metaphors in a certain way. If I can give one quick example to
Please.
see
Yeah.
how this is, I'm working on a book on biblical law, the literature of biblical
Mm.
law, and kind of how to read it better rather than worse. And one of the things I've noticed is that people bring to biblical law, they bring the metaphors of you break or you keep the law.
Oh,
Um, and it is true that the metaphor of keeping the law is used within the Torah, the Pentateuch. But keeping, actually, there is no breaking the law. You can transgress against it. You can go against the flow of the law, but you can't break it in the sense of, you know, like break a
yeah.
stick in the same way that we have, because it's not legislation. It's not working in a legislative statutory kind of way. And it does use the metaphor for keep, but keep is shamar, is this idea of like you keep sheep, you keep a garden,
Mm.
you keep the temple. It's like fostering,
And
tending,
yeah.
causing to flourish. So it's
Right.
instruction that causes that if you go in the direction of the instruction, and this is why Jesus said, you know, he's using this language, I am the way, the truth, and the life, right? That this causes things to flourish if you go in this way.
Mm.
So it's we have a different conceptual metaphor, a legal world that we come from, kind of built of a Greco-Roman legalist structure and Enlightenment legalist thinking. That when we say you break or keep a law, we don't have to explain what that means. If we were
Right.
talking to an Iron Age Hebrew, we'd have to explain the metaphors. Like, okay, I get keep, but why break? Well, like, what's going
Yeah.
on there? Yeah.
Wow. Oh, wow. The implications of that start to get profound.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Very quickly, this
Yeah.
all starts adding up. So you really have to think about how are metaphors working within their conceptual world, which obviously will play into issues of
Yeah.
like natural selection.
Yes. Yeah. It makes me think. I haven't read Lakoff and Johnson's work,
Yeah.
Metaphors to Live By, but yeah, it's obviously making me think about that. And
Yes. Very
um,
heavily. And actually, the work they went on to do after that is the real gold
oh,
of analogical reasoning with Mark Johnson, and then George Lakoff's Fire, Women, and Danger. No, Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things. Probably the best title of a book I've ever
that's
read.
fantastic.
But
I've
it's
never even heard of that.
oh my goodness. But yeah, he
Wow.
goes all the way down to the level of philosophy of mathematics with metaphors and analogical reasoning. So
Oh
yeah,
my
it's some
goodness.
interesting
Okay.
stuff.
I'm glad this
Yeah.
came
So
up. That sounds, yeah, I'd love to get into that. So that's a really helpful example. So like the kind of the invisible, yeah, invisible conceptual world that we live in the example of taking kind of a Western jurisprudence, post-enlightenment concepts and then importing them back into a different conceptual world
yeah.
can uh now I'm thinking way too much about the words I'm using. I was going to say that doing that importation can break
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
can break
It's hard.
concepts, you know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's hard to get past the metaphors.
Yeah. So what you're doing, that's a really helpful way to set kind of the stage for what you're doing in this book, which is to say, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's to say, let's look at the actual conceptual world of Darwin's work,
Mhm.
that evolutionary, yeah, process of viewing history, and the conceptual, set it next to the conceptual world of the Hebrew scriptures. And maybe just set aside all the debates that rage about the age of rocks and all that stuff
Right.
and look at those conceptual worlds and see, are there points of overlap, and then maybe ultimately reveal, are there more profound points of dissonance or profound points of overlap that we're missing because we just keep, staying in these ruts. Is that a fair way to
Yes.
summarize the?
That's exactly it. And I think the more profound conflicts. So the
Yeah.
conflicts that we often point out are actually the superficial ones, and actually I think there are
Right.
deeper conflicts. But appreciating the deeper conflicts also helps you to appreciate the deeper affinity between these two conceptual worlds.
That's so helpful. So the three areas in which you explore in the book: scarcity of resources, generation, essentially sex and generation, and then fitness to the environment. I don't think you do them in that order, but those are the three. Let's talk a little bit about like what did you discover in the process of writing this? And I think it'd be great to keep chasing this theme of like affinity versus dissonance.
Mhm.
So yeah, what did you discover about kind of putting these conceptual worlds next to each other, and maybe pick one of those three, and then talk a
Yeah.
little bit about affinity or dissonance there.
Well, I stuck with those three because they're the three elements of natural selection that Darwin kind of sticks to. Later
Right.
evolutionary science will feature lots of other things like gene flow and gene drift. And,
Mhm.
they're not necessarily actually going to reduce what they consider evolutionary thinking down to natural selection. Natural selection is one. And then there's a question whether Darwin has competitive violence as a result of scarcity of resources, or in the domain of scarcity of resources, where a lot of modern thinking has cooperative work between even at
Right.
the level of bacteria,
Oh wow.
cooperating all the way up to the level of hominids, apes, chimpanzees cooperating, even human cooperation as a feature of selection process as well. So
Mm,
it's not, while Darwin has a very clean, neat version of it, I think it's fair to say that most evolutionary biologists think it's more complicated than that. And and some are even offended at Darwin's, of course, a man came up with an idea that violent competition is the only way that the species goes forward, right?
right.
And
Hmm.
so there's a feminist critique of that. But there's early, like in the 1930s, there's people already saying violence is the Darwinian fallacy, right? Violent
Mm,
competition is the fallacy of Darwin. Um, so I was just noticing that, I'm thinking about Darwinistic natural selection, and I'm reading Genesis over and over again every semester. And I wrote a little book on Genesis 1 through 11, a little layperson's commentary to kind of help them understand Genesis 1 through 11 as a piece of literature. And I just cannot not see, like, wait, Genesis 1 through 11, and then going on from there, but certainly in Genesis 1 through 11, it's so clear that the biblical authors are concerned about fit to environment,
mm,
scarcity of resource. I mean, the curse of the man and the woman is scarcity
yeah.
of resource, food,
Yeah.
and fertility issues, fertility scarcity as well.
Wow.
Um, and then they don't fit to the environment, and it's interesting why the difference is why they don't fit to the environment. It's a moral issue in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. And then they're obsessed with generation, like not
Hmm.
your child, not procreation. I think Christians often think it's all about procreation, but they're actually
Yeah.
obsessed with the idea of your great great grandchildren who you will never know or see, right?
Wow.
How do you live today in light of those people, and those people represent you living long in the land even after you are gathered up to your fathers and die and
Mm,
buried in the land.
mm. Yeah, that sends my mind spinning in a lot of directions. One thing I'm thinking about is like your comment there about procreation versus generational lineage. I'm thinking back to this conceptual worlds idea, and like our conceptual world that we're in, and the ways that that informs our sense of procreation, and even in a
Mm,
post all the technologies that exist around decoupling procreation from sexual activity. I don't know. It seems like there's probably a lot to mine there that you could compare even our conceptual world to what how scripture would have talked about sex and generation, and the survival instincts there.
right.
You talk very you actually revisit. I don't know if you can think of any off the top of your head. It's okay if you can't. But you revisit some narrative sections. I think in Genesis, like I'm thinking maybe of Lot and his daughters potentially. I
Mm,
think that's in there. But like you
yep.
revisit
Yeah.
some potentially familiar narratives, but with this lens of like survival, generational
Yeah.
survival. And it really, I got to say, for me, it was very eye-opening to what's going on there. So I don't know if that sparks anything you want to flesh out or.
Yeah, well, and even Lot and his daughters, because I mean, this is one of those passages where a lot of people don't know it exists because they,
Right.
kind of tune out when they're reading. They get to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and they're like, okay, glad those people are done with,
Right.
right? Toasted and roasted. And then you get to Lot and his daughters, and it's part of there's a they call it a leitmotif, a theme throughout
Yeah.
Scripture of two women
Yeah.
complicit to do something heinous, but possibly necessary for survival.
Wow.
Um, and usually having to do with their children.
Mhm.
And we can talk about Lot and his daughters. You can talk about the two women who come before Solomon with their children. Again, they didn't do. They're not complicit in that one, but there's a parallel to that later in Kings where two women are complicit to eat their children,
Right.
as was promised in Deuteronomy 28 at the disobedience of Israel. And they approach an anonymous king and say, "Will you help us? You know, we agreed to eat our children today. We ate my child, and now this woman has hidden her child. We can't eat him, right?"
Wow.
It's just this. So you have this theme going across. We have two women complicit to it, and it often has to do with their children and generations, right? For the Lot's daughters, they say, "Let us get our father drunk with wine, because there's no men to come into us after the way of all women,"
Mm.
right? And so they seem to believe that it's not just Sodom and Gomorrah that's destroyed, but
Sodom and
everything is
Gomorrah.
destroyed. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
all gone.
Wow.
And so what seems like a generally bad idea to roofie your dad and have sex with him is made slightly more understand. It's almost like bite the bullet and we're going to do this thing. And even one has to compel the one, right? And in all
Right.
of these narratives, one of the women has to compel, okay, I did it last night. Now you need to
Wow.
go do it as well. Um, and in a world like our world, we're just like, that's gross, ooh, yuck, ick. But they're really thinking about great great grandchildren. And the narrator notes that those children became the nations of Edom and Moab, right? Which
Mm.
may be throwing a little shade at Moab and
Mm.
Edom if you know their story in the Old
Right.
Testament.
Right.
Um, but it comes from a desire to maintain the line of their father on the face of the earth. And so it wasn't about those children, it was about their great great grandchildren. So it makes a little more sense. I mean, there are modern books on this. Is the book is it Children of Man or Children of God? There's a movie
Oh, the
made of it.
science fiction
Yeah,
children of
yeah,
man.
yeah, where
Yeah, yeah.
nobody can get pregnant, right?
Yes,
And
yes.
then the
Yeah.
one woman gets
Yes.
pregnant.
Hmm.
So I think most people, because we think of like our sexuality and controlling our ability to procreate or not. But when you get to infertile couples who want to have children, all of a sudden these issues kind of come straight to the fore.
Mm.
China, back in the day, a few years ago when they had a one-child policy,
Right.
it's crazy that we're even talking about a 2 and 3 child policy now in China, and they're
Right.
incentivizing children making. But again, China is incentivizing out of
Yeah.
generational concerns. Two
Yeah.
generations from now, we're not going to have enough Chinese humans alive to keep this whole system running.
Right.
It's going to
Wow.
dwindle too much. So this is a general concern that would have probably seemed obvious to most people until like mid 20th century,
Hmm.
us radically free, sexualized individuals.
Hmm.
So some of this, all you have to do is put on the lens of sex for generational thinking, not just sex for pleasure, not just sexual assault, which also happens in scripture and of course is happening in the evolutionary origin story. You just put on this lens of how sex is being used. Um, and then what you end up doing is saying like, oh, these weird texts in the biblical literature aren't quite as weird as I thought they were. And they actually are connected into a long trajectory of what does it mean to be a human, to be in a family, to be in a relationship over time on the face of the land that God gives to you,
Yeah.
and what makes you acceptable to that land,
Mm.
what makes you fit to that land as the environment that God has given you. And so I could go on and on about those three together, but what's
Yeah.
interesting to me is that Darwin sees these three pressures of fit to environment, sexual reproduction, and scarcity that creates violent competition, or just competition, as intertwined and inextricable. He talks about them in their turn, but he sees them as all like working together as a mechanism, like almost as a Swiss watch.
Mm.
And I think that's what really struck me, is so did the biblical authors. Like you can pull on any one of these threads and talk about them. I do separate them by theme in the book, but it was always very difficult to stay on theme because you could just always see it bleeding into the other topic and the other thread.
Well, that makes intuitive sense that one would pressurize the other. Scarcity of resources is going to pressurize your survival instinct, which is going to pressurize your desire to continue your lineage. Yeah, yeah. So it
Right.
makes sense. It makes sense to me on that level. That is kind of where I wanted to, what I was thinking as you were talking is, it might be interesting to talk about this now. Like what, looking at this conceptual world, kind of, there seems like there can be a very fruitful way of asking questions like what are the deeper questions under the surface of the Darwinian conceptual world? Like, what does it reveal about the concept of humanity and humanity's place and humanity's purpose? And then how does that compare and contrast to the what the Hebrew Bible is doing with these same concepts, but then leading towards maybe different conclusions about humanity's place and
Yeah.
humanity's purpose. And does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's kind of that's kind of where my mind is going as you're talking through all that stuff, and especially how they interlock and fit together. So does that provoke any sort of response or reaction?
Yeah, I think humanity's place is interesting. I've just been doing some teaching on the land of Israel, the land of Canaan, and kind of the fit of Canaan to the land.
Hmm.
That storyline starts in, I mean, at least in Genesis 2, you might say it starts in Genesis 1 as well. That, again, the conceptual world, in the English translations, it will say, and God made the man and the man and the man and the man, but it doesn't say the man in Hebrew. I hate pulling this
Right.
move of it doesn't say that in Hebrew, but
Yeah,
it
yeah.
is one of those things where you do have to point out something obvious in the Hebrew, but not obvious in English, is it doesn't say the man, it says the dirt thing or the earth thing or whatever you want to call him. He's called the dirt thing
Yeah.
because he's made from the dirt. It's a play on words. He's called Adam. There's not a guy named Adam. He's
Right.
called the Adam
Hmm.
because he comes from the Adamah, the dirt. And so do the animals that are shaped from the dirt. And the man has the breath of life put into him. So do the animals have the breath of life in them.
Hmm.
And so you have this real sense of um, interconnectedness between the man, the earth beneath his feet, and the animals that surround him. Although part of I think the story of Genesis 2 is to say how are the man and woman different from those things in some
Right.
way. And even when violence happens, the very first act of violence, it's the dirt, the Adamah, that opens up its mouth to receive the blood of Abel, right? And it's from the dirt that his blood cries out. So
Hmm.
there's this very intense connection in these texts between the dirt beneath their feet, their own bodies and their sense of what it means to be immortal in the land, and what, not immortal, but what it means to be a
Yeah.
being in the land. What kind of beings are we? What kind of dirt thing? By the way, this is where the word human comes from, is hummus.
Humans. Yeah.
Yeah. So sorry, I said hummus. I was doing the Israeli, not the bean dip.
It was
Sorry.
delicious. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, from the hummus, right? So this is native to our way of talking about humans, if you know the background of these terms. Um, so we're very deeply connected, and what makes them fit to that land then, if you go from dirt to land, from Adamah to Aretz, you actually move into this moral world. When Cain, when the humans listen to the voice of the serpent over God's instruction, they can't stay in the land. They're no longer fit to the
Mm.
garden in Eden. When
Wow.
Cain slaughters his brother, he's no longer fit to stay in the land and farm it. He has to go, and he goes in the land of Nod, which again in Hebrew the word Nod means wandering.
Mm.
He's cursed to wander in the land of wandering, which again is a curated punishment for him because he's a crop farmer, right? And that's
Mm.
if if it were reversed and Abel were forced to wander, Abel would be like, cool, I'm a shepherd. That's what
Right.
we do, right? No problem.
Right. Right.
But he's no
Wow.
longer fit for the land and he has to wander. And Babel, who tries to re-engineer a way to secure crops and secure general security, God does not punish them. He just forces them because they're not fit to stay in this land. They're actually supposed to be doing something else. They're supposed to keep moving. It's unclear where they're supposed to keep moving to or how they would
Mm.
know when to stop and settle. Um, but there's probably all kinds of interesting threads to pull on and why Babel is such a particularly nefarious place for them, even before the exile and all that. So there's this deep, deep sense that you come from the land, you belong to the land. I mean, it even gets played out in interesting threads in Exodus, like you come from slavery. Uh, you never leave slavery. Israel is never not slaves. Hold on, a double negative. They are always slaves, right? They just get transferred from the house of Pharaoh as cruel and oppressive slavery into the just wife, loving of slavery of God, right? So they're always called
Mm.
slaves.
Wow.
Moses is called the slave of, like, they never leave the metaphor of slavery.
Paul calls
Um,
himself a slave.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
Christ, the slave of Christ. Christ is a slave. He was humble to the form of a slave, right?
wow.
So yeah, there's no begrudging the term slave. It's the kind of slavery, the oppressive, the cruel, the ruthless, the
Right.
bitter form of slavery. That's even in the Passover. That's what's remembered about slavery is the bitterness of it.
Right.
Um, so, but what makes them fit to that land or not? Is how they behave on the land. And Leviticus, before he takes them up into the land, he warns them like, hey, and Exodus 22, if you mistreat the foreigner, if you oppress the widow, if you oppress the orphan, I'm going to kill all of you. My anger will grow hot, and I will kill all of you, and your wives will become widows, and your children will become orphans. And then Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy keep warning them, don't act like the nations. Leviticus 19, right? Or 18. All of these things all of these horrible things I just described, this is what the nations before you did, and that's why they are being vomited out.
Mm.
So this is where I think that deep conflict is, where Darwinian thought and then later evolutionary science really has no place. I mean, it's interesting. There are all kinds of parallels between the morality of how you treat each other, how you treat the land, and whether you're fit for it. You get some of this in some like romantic indigenous thought, like romantic thought about indigenous
Yeah, yeah.
people, right? Where, like that book, The Ecological Indian, that kind of destroys the idea that Native Americans were somehow at one with the land and
Right, right,
didn't totally environmentally devastate it in different periods. And which they did, right? Depending on who you're
right.
talking about and when. So, but even then, this idea, I mean, you'll hear this environmental thinking. We don't deserve this land because of the way we've treated it. So
Yeah,
it's not
yeah.
like this is an entirely foreign mechanism to our thinking.
Wow.
Um, but we don't think of if I murder, I take it back. If somebody's murdered in a house, it's hard to sell the house,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
I was talking to Zhang Holang Haokip, who is a theologian in Northeast India, and he was a systematic theologian that moved back to his home country of the Northeast, where it's not Hindu, it's like primitive religion.
Mm.
And he says in this primitive religion, if somebody is murdered, they go give a sacrifice to the gods so that their fields will be fertile the next year.
Oh, wow.
Because they assume the murder offends the gods, and that will affect their crops that come in for the next year.
Wow.
So and this is like today. This is
Yeah,
not,
yeah. Uh-huh.
in like Iron Age. So I don't think this way of thinking is entirely foreign to us,
Right.
but it's hard to ask someone who's doing modern hardcore evolutionary science and like doing the research to say like, hey, have you thought about the metaphysics of divine morality and how that might affect all of this?
Right.
I mean, I think it's fair to say like, well, I think it's good for theologians to think through this. For theologians of science, lots of scientists are theists, and lots of them are
Yeah.
Christian. I think the majority of them believe in God, and many of them are Christians. It's good to have these conversations. I don't think it's fair to necessarily import them all on all science and say, hey, unless you're thinking about the theology of your science, then you're not
Right.
doing anything.
Right. Right.
Um,
Yeah.
okay, sorry, I'll stop my
No,
rampage
no. Wow.
there.
That was, yeah, no, that was really, really interesting and helpful. Yeah, you started to get at a little bit of where the limitations of kind of evolutionary thought as it relates to humanity's place in the world and some of those ethical kind of maybe it is so interesting. And another thing I'm thinking as listening to you and processing all this is like I just keep coming back to what we miss when we stick to the tried and true debate points
Yeah.
again about Age of Rocks or whatever, Bishop Usher's calendar or whatever like when we stick to those, when we just keep batting those back and forth. And there, maybe there's an irony or there's almost a humorous part of this to me as I listen to you and thinking about actually looking at Darwin's pillars of his conceptual world, and then comparing them to the scriptures brings out so much more.
Mm.
It just illuminates so much more of what's going on. That actually helps read scripture better, in my
Yeah,
view.
hopefully. Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know if that gives you any more that you want to build off of there, but I would love to think about. And I also love to ask you. I'd love to think about more about the departures and dissonances and like the
Mhm.
limitations of the conceptual world, the Darwinian conceptual world, versus the questions that the biblical authors are really answering and the story they're
Yeah.
telling about the world. I'd also love to just hear, so if you want to answer that, or I'd love to hear about like if there's anything that was, because it strikes me that the themes of violence and sexual violence, and there's a lot that seems very dark.
Yeah.
And maybe on some level we like the tried and true debates because we don't talk about any of that stuff. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I would love to hear you just talk about anything that was challenging to explore and write about as well. So I don't know. I just gave you a lot to potentially
Yeah.
there, but
Well, I mean, one of the things that certainly is directly connected to what you're saying here is I think the biblical author's conceptual world, the part that we miss is that they believe the world used to be one way. It is
yes,
now in a desperate, fractured, like the cancerous, there's all kinds of metaphors you could
yeah,
throw on the way the world is twisted, corrupted, warped, cancerous, broken, not the way it's supposed to be, as Cornelius Plantinga so
yeah,
eloquently said. Um, and that it's going to one day not return to an identical state that it was in the beginning, but it's going to come to a reoriented state where things that have all been twisted are going to be untwisted and straightened
mm,
out, right? In some way. And that there are all kinds of interesting examples of what that might look like. Paul kind of rightfully seems to signal there will be continuity, but it's difficult to understand what
yeah,
what the glorified, as we would say, the glorified body looks like. I gave some indications at the end of the book that like if this it's I think the best word for this is this metaphysical reorientation of the universe. Like the universe was oriented one way, it gets disoriented in the period that we know of, which is why I think the biblical authors could look at what Darwin says and what a lot of evolutionary science says, and just their observations and say, yeah, there's
mm,
definitely there's violent competition, there's some cooperation that actually shapes the bodies of creatures on Earth. I mean, we can
mm,
see, you know, natural selection is not one of those things that requires hundreds of thousands of years to see. You
right,
can actually see it working today. So I don't think that should be the pressure point for Christians in the argument. And sometimes we collapse natural selection into evolution as if they're one thing.
oh, that's a good point. Yeah,
So I think the biblical authors could look at natural selection and go, yeah, animal and human bodies are being shaped by these various pressures that we're discussing. I mean, my kids' age, you know, who are college age, they have like iPhone neck, which wasn't a thing, obviously,
right,
up until 10 years ago. So like they actually have a chiropractic condition, and in the same way that I'm sure my generation is just generally, you know, we don't have iron plow shoulders, you know, or whatever, whatever. As Sherry Turkle from MIT once said, our tools shape us, and I think that means our bodies as well, right?
mm.
Um, so wait, why was I telling you this? I got
You were talking
myself
about the
into
orientation, disorientation, the
yeah,
progression.
yeah. So I think that basic metaphysical, thank you very much for that.
Sure, sure.
That basic feature of their thinking is, yes, this is the way the world is now, but the laws of electromagnetism and thermodynamics, they may work the same way, but in a reoriented way. And I think it would be interesting to hear scientists work some of those things out,
Wow.
if they thought theologically about them. So that just in and of itself brings a very different concept. And that is not like
Yeah.
Nietzsche's critique that we're trying to escape reality and get
Right,
into heaven.
right.
This is saying no, the same stuff is going to be reoriented, or as
Yeah,
my buddy Tom Wright likes to say, that it's going to be put to rights, which kind
yeah,
of is the general sweeping statement, right?
yeah.
Um,
That's really
I
good.
think when along that line, that things didn't used to be this way and now they are, and we're kind of having to deal with it. I think one of the darkest things that I had to deal with in the book was the chapters on sex. Honestly, I was looking forward to writing the chapters on sex only because I thought this will be the easiest part to entertain with. You know, as an author, you're always like trying to keep people hooked in.
Yeah, yeah.
I thought, well, it won't be hard to hook people in with
Right,
sex,
right.
right? And then I started reading a lot of the evolutionary biology and psychology on sexual procreation and propagation. And kind of to my horror, I knew it was true, but I didn't. There's two things that disturbed me, one worse than the other. The first one was that male and female sexual differentiation is a flaw in evolution. It shouldn't have happened this way. It should have just been unisex, self-reproducing. We should have been
Unisex.
biological
Yeah.
creatures because male and female sexual behavior is inefficient. It's deadly. It's like the worst thing that it basically makes evolution look foolish from kind of evolutionary perspective. But it happened, and they're just stuck dealing with it.
I want to, if I can, sorry, if you
Yeah, go
hold
ahead.
your point, I want to interject a real quick thing there because we actually already referenced one sci-fi story, and I'm a big sci-fi fantasy reader, and uh, it's so interesting how science fiction, especially at its best, I think can like illuminate some of these things. And Isaac Asimov's very famous series Foundation, I think it's in the last book of that series. Um, he he imagines this situation in which the characters are like visiting different planets, trying to like learn where this ancient mythological Earth
Mm.
was that humans supposedly came from. And this one planet they stumble on, they find this outpost of humanity that had been there for so long that they had evolved. They'd evolved actually in a different direction. They had evolved back into they evolved into being asexual creatures.
Mm.
They learned how to control.
Self-reproducing, I assume.
Yeah, they learned how to essentially control their evolutionary progress, and they quickly determined this is going to be best for everybody because we'll have a peaceful utopian world if we can just
Mm.
get rid of sexual
Right.
procreation, which is like really like head spinning to think about, but it just points back to what you're saying that yeah.
And I think good sci-fi has to deal with this particular issue. I'm thinking of Aldous Huxley's Brave New
Oh,
World. I
sure,
mean, it's
yeah.
centered around like suppression of
Yeah.
sexual desire, right?
Nice.
Because that's part of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
so what I did not know, that was the first thing that was a little
Yeah.
surprising to me. And then the other thing was that the kind of the general blanket assumption by I think all anthropologists and evolutionary scientists is that most of hominid propagation and sex happens through forced copulation, which is the polite term. What we amongst humans we call that rape or sexual assault.
Yeah.
But and what I also did not appreciate is that 99% of animal species, the female is larger than the male, right? And so,
Mm.
and in some
Wow.
cases that causes the females to do forced copulation as well. But it's more rare for females to, I believe this is correct, that females for whatever reason on the whole do not sexually assault in order to get pregnant. But the species, I think dolphins, apes, humans, where males are bigger, you do actually see a lot more instances of forced
Mm.
copulation. And so the assumption is basically humans were created through a long history of rape. And I mean, there's some very
Wow.
controversial books by anthropologists and evolutionary biologists on this that have been disputed since the 90s. And honestly, I don't know where those debates have landed. It seems to have landed in a bunch of like a war of mutual submission where everybody's just like, okay, that's probably what's going on. So when I hear people, I mean, I've heard Christian theologians, talk about how humans were these finely tuned creatures made by God through this instrument of evolutionary progress. You get this kind of progressive notion that the world's getting better and humans are kind of the zenith of that progress, which makes sense within that paradigm. But then I'm sitting here, I was listening to a guy
Wow.
recently who was saying this in a public lecture, and I'm sitting there thinking, finely tuned, marvelous process. Like you realize, I mean, you're indicting God, I think, in most evolutionary scientists' mind of using rape to finely tune what humans would be. And
Wow.
so
Wow.
that seems like a more profound conflict than anybody's paying attention to.
Yeah.
Which again gets into the notion, and like the conflict is really profound because Genesis 1 opens up with what I generally took to be a non-controversial statement. Let us make man in our image. So in the image of God, he made them male and female. He made them. The image of God is male and female, whatever that means.
Mm-hmm.
Sexual differentiation is like in the, pardon the metaphor, the DNA of
Mm.
creation theology.
Mm.
Um, and so it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a malformation of how the processes went. And I know some people will just say, well, yeah, those are human authors writing, they don't know any better and they're writing that back into history. But it's not just Genesis 1 where this idea shows up. I mean,
Right.
it kind of goes all the way through most languages. Almost all languages are, except for English, and English has it too, are gendered, right?
Yeah. Right.
I mean, they work like people think through the sexes, through male and
Mm.
female sexes. It's part of their conceptual world.
Mm.
I think one
Mm.
of the interesting things about an English speaking conceptual world is that we've, for the most part, tried to do away with gendered language. And I'm not talking about like the gender wars and they,
Yeah.
them, he, she, or whatever. I'm talking about
Yeah.
the actual way we think about we don't think about whether a tree is a female or a male
Right. Right.
in the way that we talk about it,
Right.
right?
Right.
Yeah, so there's all kinds of interesting things. The sex part was a little dark. And the biblical stories on sex, I'd written an article like "What's up with all the weird sex in Genesis" for Christianity Today. They asked me to write it. I didn't like come up with the idea by myself. And you go through it and you're just like there's
Doesn't
just
it feel good to
the
be asked, the guy that they asked to do that? Yeah.
yeah.
Anyway.
Well, there is a little bit of like, who would write that? Like, who would put their name on that article? Because everybody could write that. Anybody could write that article. Like,
Yeah,
who would put
right.
their name on it? And apparently, I'm like, yeah, sure, slap my name on that one. Um, yeah. So I think the biblical authors are not prudish about sex. They certainly have descriptions of sexual assault directly in Scripture. And they definitely take a very highly negative view of sexual assault, which most cultures do, but they take an even more intensely negative view of sexual assault. It's a capital crime, as it was in the United States until the 1970s. Um, and I haven't heard anybody rectify that, what seems to me be like a blaring problem with just wholesale appropriating theistic evolution and just saying like, yeah, God just used evolution, got us to here, and then it all worked out.
Mm,
Um, so I hope
wow.
somebody can work it out, or
Yeah.
in either direction. Say it's
Yeah.
just absolutely impenetrable, an impenetrable theological problem, or that there's some way in which it can work out. But I haven't heard anything yet.
Wow, that's interesting. And that, yeah, that pushes in an unexpected way, pushes back on the theistic evolutionary narrative. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's being rebelled. And it's a theodicy issue too on some level. Yeah, where
absolutely. Yeah,
and
and with I
apologetics,
mean,
and
yeah,
it reminds me of that famous Augustine quote about when we speak foolishness to people who understand the things we're talking about, I'm totally butchering the quote, but
yeah,
what I'm referencing.
yeah.
We kind of make fools of ourselves and fools of what we believe.
And
And
a sizable part of any population, at least the American population, has suffered some kind of sexual abuse.
yes,
So it's like a palpable existential problem. So like we're not. I hope nobody understands that we're talking about this casually in any way.
no,
I mean, this
no,
is a real thing that people can reflect back on and say like, wait, did God do something like what happened to me? He did something like that in order to like create all reality. That would just require some very different categories, and I think the biblical authors are willing to bend
yeah,
around what sex is, what it's for, and how it can be properly and improperly performed. So,
mm, mm. Yeah, it's definitely not an abstract issue for many, many, many people. Man, well, we're coming up on the end of our time. But I'd love to just ask kind of some like final. I like the last thing I like to ask is what people are reading and working on, kind of
mm,
what's coming up next. But before that, just kind of a tying it all together question. What if you could wave your magic wand? I don't know, like what would you like? What do you want your book to kind of accomplish in the broader
mm,
conversation? What would you like to see a reader take away from the project? That kind of I guess I
yeah.
want to ask you that kind of question in closing.
Um, This sounds very bizarre to say because it's a Christian audience. I mean, I assume non-Christians are reading. I know some of my Jewish
Yeah.
friends will read it, and so I hope people do read it. Not because I'm not trying to sell books, but I think there are some genuinely good things to think about that I enjoyed thinking about that I think others would, and that would be helpful. But, but really, I want Christians to take the biblical author's view of the world more seriously. I
Mm,
mean, I know nobody wants to say they don't. Everybody will say they
right.
do.
Right.
But there's part of me where people say like, "Oh, I have a very high view of Scripture," and then I hear them say things. I'm like, "Do you?" Like, I don't know. You just really quickly conflated like American cultural religion with what the biblical authors are saying, or you
You have
just
a high view
conflated a
of your view of scripture.
yeah, or yeah, you conflated Augustine's view of that.
Right.
Very yeah, just assumed Augustine was right on that one, and
Mm,
so
interesting.
so I think Augustine's conceptual world is a deeply problematic conceptual world, as he would admit as well. He lives in a Neoplatonic kind of
Mm,
eco chamber or ecosphere,
hmm.
which he sees as problematic. I'm not sure he sees it as problematic as the biblical authors would. I think they would kind
Wow.
of point to him and go like, "Hey, you got bigger issues than the ones you pointed out." It
Yeah,
doesn't
of
mean you don't read Augustine. Augustine's
course,
great,
of
and
course.
he's doing all kinds of interesting things for the people of his time who live in his conceptual world.
Right.
Many of which I don't think directly poured over to ours, but some of them surely do.
Right.
Um, so I want to get people to like be able to like tune out and say, "Hey, these texts aren't just to predict that Jesus came. but they're their own world that actually Jesus himself submits himself to. I mean, when he
Mm,
says things like, I did not come to abolish the Torah, I came
yeah.
to fulfill it, he means this conceptual world is the one he's bringing forward into the world.
Wow.
Um, and you see that with all the writings of Paul and Peter and James and John in the Gospels, as they keep coming back to the Torah as the authoritative source of their own thinking, including like with sex. I think I pointed out in the book, when Jesus is asked about divorce, which seems to intimate they wanted a divorce in order to have sex with another woman, like they're looking at another woman besides their wife, like, hey, would you allow that kind of divorce like Moses did? He says it was not so from the beginning, goes back, quotes Genesis 2, that a man and woman should cling to each other sexually, right?
Mm,
And what God, and then he puts that what we have in all the weddings, that's not in Genesis, but what God has put together, let nobody tear asunder, right?
mm,
So
mm,
he clearly sources his own thinking out of these texts, and chastises people who try to get out of this thinking, who
mm,
try to discount it or move too quickly out of it, or inappropriate apply it to present context. So he's a sharp thinker, of course, and I just want Christians like to get kind of where Jesus, Paul, James, Jude, Peter are in their view, like that they would esteem the text as highly as they do and
mm,
submit themselves just like Jesus does to the Torah.
mm.
And I don't mean submit like
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
Judaism is right, everything else is wrong. I mean it in a wholesale sense. He like really believes that all in the law and as he says, all in the law and
Yeah.
the prophets appointed to this, to me,
Yeah.
my death, resurrection, etc.
Yeah. To esteem the biblical text higher is a laudable goal.
Yeah,
That's really,
it
really
is.
well
It's
said.
difficult too. Yeah.
Yes, 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 yes. Well, I, 100% commend this book, and I suspect my humble little corner of the internet. I think they really resonate with your project, and the way and for me as I grew up Christian. I grew up in essentially fundamentalistic, if not adjacent to fundamentalistic culture, Christian culture. Rediscovering the text through these kinds of approaches, like respecting the
Mm,
conceptual world, seeing the literary flourishes and the literary brilliance of its composition, and I would put you and a handful of other authors that have had really profound impact on me rediscovering that. All I'm trying to say is that even though I grew up, in many ways, you could say I grew up soaked in the text,
mm,
but I did not grow up with this high esteem and this kind of humble, reverential,
mm.
submissive spirit you're talking about. And all I'm trying to say is that there is so much like joy and beauty in approaching the text that way that I didn't grow up with, and it's
Yeah.
really, really for me birthed. It sounds fundamentalistic to say this, but it's like I just love the Bible. I
Right.
love the Scripture
I
this
no, I
way, and
know
there's
what you
like
mean.
a
Yeah.
second naivete of reapproaching it that way. That's a really a profound, amazing thing, and it's something that in my work in ministry and even just what I'm doing these conversations on YouTube, I really would love to further that.
Mm.
So very much the same. I don't know, same idea, same goals. Um, Anyways, wasn't meaning to go into all that, but in closing, before you have to go, anything you want to point people to, what you're working on, what's coming next, projects, podcasts, writings, anything like that?
Uh, Nothing point to. The next book I'm working on right now, which I'm pretty excited about, is again explaining biblical law. I'm writing some fiction for the first time in my life. So
Oh,
there's
nice.
some
Cool.
So there's a murder mystery. I'm explaining biblical law, and I'm telling a story about a murder mystery in a small village in Iron Age Israel. And don't worry, I have a fiction editor who's working with me. Um, but that it's been both terrifying and really fun because I'm trying to figure out
Yeah.
how do you get people in this completely different mindset of legal thinking that is so different than ours without just telling them, no, 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 you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. So I thought, oh,
Right.
I'll tell a story. So we'll see how it goes.
That's exciting.
So
Who's publishing that? Are you able to say
that's
who's
Baker Academic
making? Okay. Oh,
is
great.
publishing that. So that should be out in about a year or so.
Okay.
I'll have it done this summer, and it's been fun because I love, it's fun to write a book on something that you constantly feel like you're harping on,
Yeah.
like where they're like
Yeah. Yeah.
finally just to get it out
It's
in
kind of
like
in your
a
bones.
10,
Yeah.
yeah, 10 chapter form, and you can go like, there, I said it. Now I can point people to it. And I think the murder mystery, in my own opinion, and my wife said that she thinks it's actually really it's a who done
Engaging.
it and how's it going to work out, and it really is compelling. So
Oh, awesome. That sounds great. I would love to. I'll review it. I'll review it on the channel when it comes out, and we'll talk about it.
It's half undergraduate textbook, half murder mystery. So
That's awesome. I don't think I've ever read anything quite like that before. It does make me think of those, A Week in the Life of series that I think I've
yes, yep.
read fiction through.
I was definitely inspired by reading
Yeah,
a few of those. So
it's a great approach. It's a really great approach. Awesome. Well, we'll look forward to that and pay attention. I will be paying attention to other work you do. Appreciate your voice very much. Appreciate your work. And thank you for the time. It's great.
Hey, I appreciate you and your work here too. I've become a big fan since, of course, I found you through a Google alert of my name.
Right.
And then since then, I think I've watched almost all of your videos. So I
Wow.
really do appreciate the service that you do for the community, as well as helping people get into books they might not have seen otherwise.
Oh, thank you. It means a lot. Thank you.